So today's lesson, we're going to talk about how to set up and solve problems using proportions. And the last lesson, we talked about the idea of when we set up a proportion, sometimes we can set it up as a ratio or as a fraction. So we're going to take a look at that and say, well, if we look at our scenario, how do we get our answer? Now, a precursor is that this can be done in many different ways. The goal of this lesson is to actually able to set up. So how do we set this up so that this setup is clear to someone else how you solve it? Now, that could be different from each person, but I'm going to present a way that it could be clear to someone, and then we could be able to communicate that with someone else. And that's part of the difficulty with mathematics, is how do we communicate it so that everyone understands why your answer is right, or how did you get to your answer. That's the key. So we're going to look at a few questions here, and hopefully you'll see a setup that makes sense. If you have another way of setting it up that still communicates your thinking clearly, then we can have some good conversations about what that looks like. So, ratio to cats and dogs in a pet shop is 4:7. If there's 16 dogs in the pet shop, how many cats are there? Set a proportion to solve. So, many different ways of doing this. One way of doing this is thinking about it in words. All right, and it allows you to kind of keep things in your mind straight. So we know that this 4:7 represents dogs to cats. So we learned in the last lesson that whatever way the proportion is talked about in the question has to match up to that. And we can leave it as a proportion, or we can put it into fraction. It doesn't really matter. I know that when I solve it, sometimes I make this as a fraction. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to set it up as a fraction. So I'm going to say this is dog to cat. That is 4:7. Well, when we set up a proportion, we need two sets of fractions, or two ratios. Well, if there is 16 dogs, well, if there was 16 dogs, how many cats are there? Well, when we are finding the number of cats, this is where we're going to introduce a variable, x. All right, so if I look back at my fraction here, if I'm building on that, I'm going to put x down here. Why? Well, we know that proportion is 4:7, 7 being the cats. It has to be in the same layer. All right. Likewise, if I did the same thing with my proportion as a ratio, that would have to be my x there, because we're solving for the number of cats. Likewise, dogs, there's 16 dogs, I'm going to have the 16 there. Likewise, if I was doing it in the ratio, the 16 would be there. Now we can solve. So the hard part is not the solving part. The hard part is taking the information from the question and putting it in a place where it makes sense for you to understand how to answer that. Well, if I'm solving this, this is 4/7 equals 16 over x. All right, and we can use our cross multiplying method. All right, say that now that's 4 times x equals 7 times 16. And just like we did with the last lesson, I can solve it like that. I didn't do anything with the 4x. All right, and we know that we can divide by 4. That gets me 28. All right, therefore, there would be 28 cats for 16 dogs using the same ratio. Okay, so to kind of highlight what we just did is we took the information that we knew, and if it's set up in a ratio or a fraction, it doesn't matter. The key part, this is the important part, is understanding what the ratio looks like or the fraction looks like in words. And if you understand it in words, this becomes really easy to understand. All right, write down, circle, highlight, underline, whatever you have to do to find that information. But this setup allows you to get your brain to process it, how to guess it. Now, I didn't guess. I went in and tried to solve it as best I could. Okay. Kira answers 7 out of the 8 questions on the test correctly. There are 120 questions on the test. How many does she answer correctly? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push pause, and I'm going to see is, can you set up either if it's a ratio or a fraction similar to what I did up here? Can you set this up? And then I will come back after you tried it, and then you can give that a go. All right, so what I did was made a ratio to 7 to 8, 7 being the correct, 8 being the total questions. All right, or you could set it up as a fraction. So this is a big or. So you don't have to do both, but pick out something. But write it in words. I also knew that there was 120 questions, and we're asking how many did she answer correctly. All right, and then I can solve that. All right, so I can use my tool to solve that we did before. I can say that that now is 8x equals 7 times 120. I know that's 840. And then I'm going to take that 840 divided by 7. No, sorry, divided by 8. All right. Therefore, now I can answer my question. Therefore, Kira would answer 105 correct out of 120 total questions. There we go. All right. That's what we're looking at. Now, some of you might be able to do this in your head. Awesome, wonderful, perfect. But sometimes you got to write it out. And not all of them are going to be the easiest way of getting the answer. So we need to show some communication. Okay? All right. 3. On pink day, 2 in every 5 students wore pink. If there were 710 students, how many wore pink? All right. So again, I'm going to shut it down here for a second. I want you to try to set up your fraction. I know that's kind of weird with that pen. All right. And let's give that a go. So push pause, give it a go. All right, and here we go, come back. So if I look at this and I ask myself, well, 2 out of 5 wore pink. Well, I can build a fraction, 2 over 5. And I also know that there's 710 total students, and we want to know how many wore pink. There's my x. So it's all about setting up that fraction. All right. And I'm not guessing and checking. I can put that in there. All right. Cross multiply 5x, 2 times 710. Multiply that out, and then I can divide by 5 to get that answer. There we go. 284 people wore pink. Out of 710. There we go. All right. So I'm not saying that those are hard problems. Now we're going to get into harder problems. So here's one that we might need to require more thinking. Janice and Irene buy apples at different stores. Both stores sell apples by the kilogram. All right, so by the weight. Janice pays $6 for 3.75 kilograms. Irene pays $5.25 for 3 kilograms. How much more will Irene pay than Janice if they each bought 9 kilograms of apples? Show your work. Lots of different things going on. And this is where sometimes to show your thinking, you can do it in your head and then you kind of mix up kind of where the numbers are. So it's not just a straight 1-to-1 answer. We may have to set up some 2 fractions. All right. So we might have to think about what Janice did and what Irene did. Now, if I look at this, I'm still using this, I'm comparing the same thing. I'm comparing money to kilograms. So if I'm looking at this, both of these scenarios I'm going to set up with money in kilograms. All right. And what we know about the money is we know that $6 Janice paid for 3.75 kilograms. And Irene paid $5.25 for 3 kilograms. The question now is, what are we going to do to figure out how much more Irene will pay than Janice? Hopefully you spotted something as you read the question. If you read the question, is we want to know what happens when they buy 9 kilograms. Well, guess what? We want to be able to figure out how much it's going to cost when I have 9 kilograms here. And I'm going to do 2 different variables here. So I got 9 kilograms for Irene, 9 kilograms for Janice. All right. And then we can give that a go. So I'm going to hit pause. I want you now try how to solve those 2 proportions. Give that a try. So this is what I came up with. So what we can do is we can use our cross multiplying idea. 375x equals 9 times 6. I can multiply that together to get 54 and then divide it by the 375 to get 1440, and that's for 9 kilograms. Irene we did the same thing. We cross multiplied. All right, and then solved it for y, and we got 1575. The question is, have we answered the question? Well, sometimes we have to look back. Well, the question is, how much more will Irene pay than Janice if they bought 9 kilograms? Well, do we have that answer there? No. But how much more is we want to find the difference. So we want to find the difference from Irene to get that answer. So I can do 1575 minus the 1440 to get $1.35. And there's my answer. Therefore, Irene paid $1.35 more than Janice if they bought 9 kilograms of apples. Okay, so multiple steps. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of the things that I'm doing to get the answer. But what I'll tell you is, if you can set up fractions or ratios to answer each part to compare, finding the answer will be a lot easier. So keep that in mind as you're moving through some of the practice questions today. Is some of them may be very straightforward. Great, awesome, wonderful. But when you get into the more complex ones, we need to write them out like that so that we can see our thinking, right? And add some English to it. Explain to me why you got those answers, or what do those answers mean? Because that'll tell you the complete understanding of it. All right. So let's take a look at one more, and then we'll let you move on to the practice. Raisins and sunflower seeds are sold together in packages of 250 grams. Raisins and sunflowers. The ratio of the mass of the raisins to the mass of the sunflower seeds is 3 to 5. Determine the mass of the raisins in a package. So there's a little bit more thinking here that goes on with that. Well, if I look at this and I ask myself, what do we know? Well, we know that the ratio between raisins to sunflower seeds is 3 to 5. So that's one thing that we know. The other thing we know, that in the package, it has 250 grams. And it's a combo of raisins and sunflowers. So what we have here is we need to have a third part of our ratio. And that third part is the total. Well, let's think about it. How do we get the total of raisins and sunflowers? Well, that total has to be 3 plus 5, because that's the total ratio parts to it. There's got to be a ratio of 8. Okay? So that's a little bit of a trick. But we know that the ratio is set up to 3 to 5. So what we're trying to solve now is how much raisins and sunflowers are there. Well, we want to know just the raisins. But if I set up my proportion, if I was looking at the weight, all right, there's my proportion. So I've got 3 parts ratio to each part. Now that becomes really tricky when you try to make a fraction, because I cannot make a fraction with 3 parts. So what I need to do is, if I'm going to build some fractions, I can only take 2 parts of the ratio. Okay? Now, luckily, this is the one that we're trying to find. We're actually trying to find this x. So what I can do with this is, when I take my fraction, I can actually say I want to compare raisins to total. Well, raisins to total is 3 to 8, and my other side of the fraction is equals x over 250. So sometimes when we have more than 2 parts, making a ratio is a lot easier. So if I was making it, if I had a recipe for a certain food, I'm going to have more than 2 parts. Well, I'm going to have to kind of work backwards to figure out how much of each parts do I have. So now I can solve that. So now I can say, well, 8x is equal to 3 times 250. And then I can multiply it together. I know that that's 750. And then I'm going to divide by 8. All right. So I got 93.75 grams. All right. And you ask yourself, well, does that answer make sense? Well, if that answer makes sense, let's put it up here. Well, we're talking about grams here, right? We're talking about grams here. This one's talking about grams. All right. Well, we're allowed to have part of a gram. That's okay. If we were talking about the number of sunflower raisins, that would be a different story. All right. Therefore, the number, or the mass of raisins in a package is, or would be, 93.75 grams. All right. So I can put that together to get that answer. All right. All right. So we're going to pick it up a little bit. Greenwood family is going on a trip to Manitoba and back. It's 1,624 kilometers from their home to Manitoba. Determine the total cost of the gas for the Greenwood's trip if the cost of gas is $1.52 per liter and the car uses 10.6 liters for gas for 100 kilometers. Lots of information there. But we know a few things here. Well, we know the cost, so one proportion is $1.52 per 1 liter. So this is what we call a rate. So it's per one quantity. And we have another fraction that we have is efficiency. Now, I'm not saying we have to use our words here, but the idea there is I know that I use 10.6 liters per 100 kilometers. Okay, so there's the second part. The other thing we know is they're going to Manitoba and back. Well, 1,624 kilometers. All right. That's one distance. Well, if they're going to Manitoba and back, I'm going to have to multiply that by 2. So we got this. So there's my total distance traveled. So the question is, at the end, what's the cost? All right. And sometimes these are hard because I'm going to have 2 sets of fractions to work through. So I'm going to push pause, and I want you to think about how you would build your sets of fractions to go for that. All right, hopefully you've tried this question, and we'll give it a go. So this is what we originally had. We said that it was $1.52 per liter, 10.6 liters for every 100 kilometers, and we figured out the distance. So the first thing, hopefully you tried, is figured out how much gas you would use. Because we know the number of kilometers, we can figure out the liters. We can set up a proportion. All right, so what I did was I set up from my proportion, X will be the number of liters I found. I can solve that. Well, if I know my number of liters now, I can figure out how much it costs by using the second fraction. All right, so I can compare the number of liters there, and it's going to cost me $1.52. All right, and then I can figure that out. So it's going to cost me roughly just over $5, $523. There we go. All right. Last question. Last week, potatoes cost $23.60 for 25 kilograms. This week, the cost has increased by 8 cents more per kilogram. How much will it cost for a 10-pound bag this week? Different scenarios. Well, what do we know? Well, last week, all right, it was $23.60 for 25 kilograms. We know we have an increase of 8 cents per 1 kilogram. And then we want to find, at the end, the cost for 10 kilograms. So we look at that. Now, the nice thing is, we are using the same type of fractions. All right? Well, if we look at this and we ask ourselves, well, most people would say, well, that should be just 23.68. No, not quite right, because this quantity is based on 25 kilograms. What we need to do is we need to figure out how much this is per kilogram from last week so that we can apply our increase. Well, what we can do is we can figure out how much is it for 1 kilogram by setting up a little proportion. So 23.60. So I can cross multiply. I can say that's and technically, if you look at that solid equation, I can actually just divide that out. 23.6 divided by 25. So now, one of the things about when we go to grocery stores is, and selling stuff, it's okay to leave the decimals as far as you can. Okay, so I would leave that, even though it's more than 3, but we thought. So what's our new price? Well, our new price goes up 8 cents. So our new price is 944 plus. So now our new price is $1 and per kilogram. All right, it's $1 and 2.4. That's why I have my calculator. And now what we can do is figure out the cost for 10. All right, so we know that this is $1.20 for 1 kilogram. Is, let's say it's Y. Okay, and I can use my rules. I'm going to take this times this. So this one's going to cost $10.24 for 10 kilograms. All right, so show the steps as you're doing the work so that you can make those connections and to answer your, define your solutions.